The dome smelled like wet clay and old metal, and the particular sourness of two people who had stopped pretending the air recycler worked properly. Kale had been awake since before the lights cycled up, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the grow beds, watching the tomato plants do nothing. They were very good at doing nothing. They had been doing nothing for 11 days. "You're going to stare them dead," Sane said from his cot without opening his eyes. "They're already dead." "Dying, there's a difference." He rolled over. The cot made a sound like a small animal in distress. "Dying means there's still time." Kale pulled her knees to her chest and looked at her hands. The knuckles were cracked from the dry air, the nails broken down to nothing from her habit of picking at them when she was thinking. She had been thinking a lot lately. Her mother used to say that Kale had been born with too much brain and not enough patience for what brains required, which was waiting. Waiting for data. Waiting for conditions to change. Waiting for something in a grow bed to do something other than die slowly under a fluorescent light that was itself dying slowly. Outside the dome's curved wall, the sky was the color it was always the color. The pale bruised amber of a sun filtered through 40 kilometers of particulate matter. The Voth had done that. Not on purpose. The Voth did not do anything on purpose exactly, which was almost worse. They had arrived in their vast slow ships and begun their vast slow process of resource extraction without pausing to determine whether anything on the surface was worth preserving. The way a child might drag a stick through an anthill, not malicious, just indifferent, and then look surprised at the small devastation left behind. Kale had been 8 years old when the first ships broke atmosphere. She was 31 now. She and Sane were, as best they could determine, the last two humans alive inside a 200-kilometer radius. They had stopped trying to determine what lay beyond that radius about 14 months ago, when the long-range receiver gave its final apologetic chirp and went dark. The dome had been Sane's project. He had been a systems engineer before. Before was how they both referred to the time when the world had been a different kind of place. And he had an engineer's way of looking at a catastrophe, which was to immediately start calculating what could be salvaged from it. He'd spent the first 6 months after the initial strikes building the dome out of prefabricated agricultural panels, photovoltaic sheeting, and an obsessive quantity of sealant tape. It was not beautiful. It was roughly oval, about 40 meters at its widest point, and it had a pronounced lean to the left side where the ground had settled unevenly. Kale had started calling it the egg. Sane preferred to think of it as a habitat module. They had argued about this with the passionate intensity of people who had very little else to argue about. Inside the egg, they had a fish pond 12 square meters of recirculating water, currently hosting a population of 9 tilapia. They had grow beds, 6 of them, running along the south-facing wall, currently hostile to everything they tried to plant. They had a small kitchen area, 2 sleeping alcoves separated by a curtain, a workshop that was mostly Sane's domain, and a narrow corridor that went nowhere in particular, which Kale used for pacing. Every morning, by agreement, they walked the perimeter of the dome. It took about 7 minutes. It was the only exercise that didn't require going outside, which they avoided when possible because the air outside made your eyes water and your lungs feel like they were being gently abraded with sandpaper. The walk served no practical purpose. Sane had begun it early on as a gesture toward routine, toward the maintenance of the small muscle of hope that required, like everything else in the dome, regular exercise to stay alive. They were on their 3rd lap when Sane stopped and crouched beside the pond. "Myra's not moving." Kale came to stand beside him. Myra was the oldest of the tilapia, named by Sane during a period when he had gone through a phase of naming everything, which had ended abruptly when naming things made losing them worse. Myra floated in the corner of the pond, her side fin moving in a slow, labored rhythm that did not look like swimming and did not look like dying, but occupied some uncomfortable space between. "She's been doing that since yesterday," Kale said. "I know. You didn't say anything." I was hoping it would resolve itself. He straightened, wiped his hands on his pants, a habit he had retained from when wiping your hands on your pants was a reasonable thing to do because you would soon wash the pants. Now it was mostly just a tick. She's the last breeding female. Kale did not say anything for a moment. She looked at Myra. Myra looked, to the extent that fish looked at anything, at the middle distance. How long does she have? A day. Maybe 2. The air in the dome shifted slightly, the recycler cycling through its wheeze, and Kale felt the weight of what he was not saying settle over the room like something physical. Without a breeding female, the population would stabilize at whatever the current males produce through their existing cycle, which was nothing, which meant attrition, which meant that in 18 months, 2 years at the outside, the pond would be empty. And the pond was the single most reliable source of protein they had. Okay, Kale said. Okay. We should eat her. Sane looked at her. When she dies, Kale said. I'm not suggesting we rush the process, but when she dies, we should eat her rather than just releasing her into the recycle. She's got good mass on her. We named her. We named all of them. It feels different with Myra. Kale looked at him sideways. He was 62 years old, gray-bearded, with the lean, angular quality of someone who had lost too much weight too fast, and then stopped losing more only because there was nothing left to lose. He had been an engineer. He had built this dome with his hands over the course of 6 months while the sky turned colors above him, and the Voth harvest chips moved slowly across the horizon like bad weather. He was the most pragmatic person Kale had ever known, and he was currently defending a fish's right to a dignified death. Myra would want us to eat her, Kale said. He almost smiled. That almost smile was one of the things that had kept Kale alive, she thought. Not the dome, not the grow beds. That almost smile that meant he was still there, still parsing the absurdity of the situation and finding something in it that was not quite funny but was close enough. They ate Myra 2 days later. Sane said a few words over the pan, which was not something he would have done before and which Kale did not comment on, because it was not the occasion for comment. He talked about Myra's particular way of holding position in the current. He talked about the way she had always eaten first, the small bossiness of her approach to the feeding corner. He talked about how, in a different world, she would have had a lake. Something about the specificity of it, the lake, the imagined ordinary life of an ordinary fish, made Kale's throat close. She looked at the pan. She thought about her mother, who had also had a particular way of approaching the feeding corner, which in her case was the kitchen of the house they had lived in before, the yellow kitchen, which in Kale's memory was always full of steam and noise and the specific warmth of being inside. She ate without tasting. That night Sane stayed up late. Kale could hear him in the workshop, the soft sounds of pages turning, the occasional mutter of a man working through a problem. She lay in her alcove and looked at the ceiling and thought about the tomato plants, and about how she had failed to make anything grow since the 3rd season, and about whether failure was a skill, whether you could get better at it, whether at some point you crossed a threshold of failure sufficient to constitute expertise. She was still thinking about this when she fell asleep. She woke to Sane shaking her shoulder, gentle but insistent in the way he had when something needed immediate attention, but was not, on balance, a disaster. Come look at something. The workshop was cluttered with the organized chaos particular to people who lived in a small space for a long time. Things acquired specific places based on use frequency rather than logic, and only the person who had arranged them could navigate the system reliably. Kale followed Sane's path through it to the small portable screen he used for the aquaponic monitoring system. "This is Aldrich," Sane said, pointing to a fish moving slowly at the edge of the pond camera's frame. Aldrich was one of the younger males. Named this was from the naming phase, after a character from a book series Sane had been fond of before. Look at his coloring. Kale looked, The fish's coloring was different. She was not a biologist. She noted that it was different in the way that you noted something without knowing what the noting meant. Sequential hermaphroditism, Sane said. He said it in the voice of a man who had been up all night and found something on page 400 of a dense biology text and followed it across 17 further pages and arrived somewhere that had simultaneously answered a question and opened a door to a room full of more questions. Some fish do it when environmental conditions change. When the population dynamics shift, it's a survival mechanism. When there's no female, a male transitions. Biology improvises. Kale stared at the screen. Aldrich is becoming female. Aldrich is in the process of becoming, yes. She was quiet for a moment. Does it work? The resulting fish, can they? If the transition completes, yes, fully functional, the pond survives. He sat back in his chair, which creaked in its familiar and specific register. Life finds a way. I know it's cliché, but I've been awake for 22 hours and I'm not looking for originality, I'm looking for accurate. Kale looked at Aldrich moving his slow circles in the corner of the tank. She thought about the word improvises. She liked it. Biology improvises. As if there were a plan that conditions had made impractical, and so biology sat down with what it had and worked out an alternative. Not gracefully, not without cost, but with a kind of stubborn material refusal to accept the premise that there was no way forward. She did not sleep again that night. She sat beside the pond and watched Aldrich and thought. The change in Kale herself began 3 weeks later. She noticed it first as a different kind of ache, not the ache she was used to, the hip pain from the thin sleeping surface, the shoulder tension from hunching over grow beds, the general systemic complaint of a body that had been underfed for 2 years. This was something else, something that felt in the most bewildering possible way like growth. She did not tell Sane immediately. This was partly because she did not know how to explain it, and partly because she had a stubborn refusal to present a half-formed observation, a habit inherited from her father, who had been a diplomat of the precise and measured kind, who would rather say nothing than say something inadequately. She sat with it for 4 days, monitoring the changes the way Sane monitored the pond's pH levels, recording without yet interpreting. On the 5th day, Sane noticed. He was checking her temperature. She had mentioned the aches, attributed them to the season, and he paused, the thermometer in his hand, his expression doing the thing it did when he encountered data that did not match his model. Kale. I know. How long? 3 weeks, roughly. He set down the thermometer and sat across from her at the small table that served as kitchen surface and workspace and dining area, and occasionally, the place where they played cards when neither of them could sleep, which was most nights. He looked at her with the full weight of his engineer's attention, which was the most thorough kind of looking she had ever experienced from another human being. Are you scared? He asked. She thought about it honestly. I'm not sure I have the bandwidth to be scared, she said. I'm interested. He looked at her for another moment and then, slowly, he laughed. It was a real laugh, not the polite kind, not the laugh that acknowledged the presence of a joke and registered approval. It came from somewhere lower and older, and it filled the dome in a way that Kale had not heard it filled in a long time. Of course you are, he said. Of course you are. The Voth Patrol came on a Tuesday, or what they called Tuesday, which was a convention maintained entirely for the psychological comfort of having a name for the sequence of days, rather than because any of them had access to an accurate calendar. Kale saw it first. She was on the perimeter walk. Alone Sane had a bad knee day, the old injury that flared with barometric changes, which suggested a weather system moving in despite everything. When the light swept the outer skin of the dome, it was the pale, milky green of the Voth survey equipment, which processed atmospheric data in a frequency that incidentally passed through most human-made materials and reflected off the compounds in the dome's inner walls. She pressed herself flat against the inner surface and breathed. The Voth were not malicious. This was the thing that had taken the longest to understand, and the thing that, once understood, made everything both better and worse. They were not hunting. They were not exterminating. They were conducting a resource survey of a planet they had identified as viable for a specific category of atmospheric processing, and the existing life forms on its surface were a variable, not a target. The way a farmer was not malicious toward the beetles in the field being plowed. The plow was not angry. The plow was just a plow. The patrol was a scan. It moved across the dome's exterior in a slow sweep, gathering data, and then it moved on. It had happened before. It had never breached the dome, possibly because the dome's signature was too small to register as significant, possibly because the Voth did not catalog human-scale structures in their survey data, possibly for reasons Kale and Sane had not yet determined. She held her breath until the light was gone. Then she went to find Sane. "They're getting more frequent," she said. He nodded. He already knew this. He had been tracking the interval between patrols, and the intervals were contracting. "They're moving into the final extraction phase for this sector," he said. "When they complete it, they'll move on. Or they'll complete it and reduce the surface pressure, and the dome stops working. Or that." They looked at each other across the table. "I think," Kale said slowly, "I think we need to consider that the problem we have is actually multiple problems, and we've been treating them as one." "Explain." She leaned forward. This was how their best conversations worked, Sane's economy with words, which made space for her to think aloud without being interrupted, and her tendency to talk her way through problems, which he could follow without the need for it to be organized or elegant. She had articulate thoughts, and he had good hearing, and together they had managed, over 2 years, to solve 17 problems that had initially presented as unsolvable. "The pond is stabilizing," she said. "Aldrich's transition is completing, that's one thing. The grow beds are failing because the soil composition has drifted, that's a different thing, a chemistry problem, solvable in principle if we can identify the deficit. The Voth patrols are a third thing, and then there's," she gestured vaguely at herself, "this, which is a fourth thing. We keep trying to stack them all into one big terrible situation and manage them collectively, but they're separate. Some of them are tractable." Sane was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you need for the soil?" "Your knowledge of the available compounds in the workshop, 2 hours of analysis. And possibly the composting material we've been saving, because we couldn't figure out what to do with it." "And the Voth?" "The Voth," she said, "I need to think about more." She thought about the Voth for the next 4 days while also beginning the soil analysis, which was painstaking and required a level of chemical precision that she was not trained for but had taught herself through a combination of Sane's library of reference texts and the specific attention of someone who could not afford to make errors. The grow bed smelled like history earth that had once been alive and was not currently alive and might, with the right intervention, become alive again. She liked that smell. It reminded her of her grandmother's garden, the one behind the house outside the city, the one with the old fruit trees and the herb rows, and the wall where the summer heat collected in the late afternoon. Her grandmother had known every plant by name, not the scientific names, or not only those, the old names, the family names, the names that described relationship and memory rather than taxonomy. "This one's for headaches. This one for the nights your heart won't slow. This one we planted the year your grandfather came home." Kale had not thought about her grandmother in a long time. She found herself talking to her now, quietly in the grow beds, explaining what she was doing and why, the way she would have explained a project for school. Her grandmother had always wanted the details. She had believed that understanding was a form of love. On the 5th day, the grow bed test patch showed the first signs of response. It was a small thing, the particular slight upward tilt of a seedling finding its orientation, the green of it still pale and provisional, the stem barely thicker than a hair. but it was unmistakably alive and unmistakably growing, and Kale sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time. She did not say anything to Sane yet. She wanted to make sure. She wanted the data to be real before she brought it to him, because she had seen his face when things stopped being real, and she was not willing to do that to him again. She was in the workshop 3 nights later, running the final calculations on the soil amendment ratios, when the light outside shifted. Not the Voth sweep. This was different. This was internal, something changing in the dome's own light quality, the photovoltaic panels redistributing their output in response to an external stimulus. She looked up. Through the translucent upper panels, something was visible that she could not immediately identify, a luminescence, a soft and sourceless glow that had no obvious origin in either the pale amber of the outside sky or the artificial spectrum of the dome's interior lighting. Green, the particular soft green of something growing. She stood at the dome wall and looked at it for a long time. Sane appeared at her shoulder. He had heard her stop moving, and in their small world, cessation of movement was a language. "What is it?" he said. "I don't know." She watched the light. "But it's not them. The color is wrong for their equipment." "The color is," he started and then stopped. Neither of them had an explanation. The light lasted approximately 4 minutes and then faded, and the amber sky returned, and the dome returned to its ordinary self. They stood at the wall for another 10 minutes after, neither speaking. Finally, Sane said, "Do you think someone else is out there?" Kale turned the question over. She thought about the light. She thought about the green of it, which had been the color of the test patch in the grow bed, the exact specific living green of something making chlorophyll in the dark. "I think," she said carefully, "that I'm not going to decide what I think until I have more information." But something had shifted. She felt it the way you felt a change in air pressure, not in your ears but in your chest, the small structural adjustment of hope being revised upward. She went to the grow bed in the morning, and the test patch had grown overnight by 3 centimeters. The amendment was working. She sat down cross-legged on the floor in front of it, and pressed the heels of her palms against her eyes and breathed slowly. This is the thing that no one ever tells you about survival, she thought. They tell you about the dramatic moments, the near misses, the crises averted, the last-second solutions. They don't tell you about this. The morning you realize something small is alive that was not alive before, and the specific quality of feeling that comes with that, which is not triumph, which has no drama to it at all, which is closer to gratitude than anything else. Like being handed back something you had convinced yourself was gone. She thought about Aldrich, moving slowly in the pond, biology improvising. She thought about the light. She thought about her grandmother's garden, the herbs planted against the wall, the old fruit trees. She went awake sane. They spent the morning in the grow beds together, amending the remaining 5 to the revised soil chemistry, moving slowly and carefully, talking as they worked. This was when they talked best, occupied with something physical, the conversation free to find its own way without the pressure of sitting face to face and needing to be important. Sane told her about his daughter, which he rarely did. He told her about a specific afternoon he remembered. His daughter at 9 years old, demanding to know how a battery worked, and the conversation that had lasted 3 hours because she kept following each answer to its next question and never seemed satisfied with stopping. She would have been good at this, he said, meaning the soil amendment calculations, meaning the pond, meaning the iterative problem-solving of survival. She always wanted to know what was at the bottom of things. Kale thought about what to say and then said the true thing, which was, "Tell me her name again." He said it. The name sat in the air of the dome, given weight by being spoken, and Kale turned it over in her mind and kept it there, in the way she kept the names of the fish and the names of the plants and the name of her grandmother's garden and the name her mother used to call her when dinner was ready. You kept the names, that was the thing. The names were a form of insisting that things had existed, that the past was real and not only memory, that the people and the lives were not deleted by their ending. "When we get out," Kale said, "I want to plant a tree." He looked at her. "When the Voth move on," she continued, "when the atmosphere clears, it'll take time, the recovery, years probably, but at some point the soil outside will be viable again. And I want to plant a tree, something that takes a long time to grow, something that will still be there when it's not us anymore, when it's the people after us." Sane was quiet for a moment. "What kind of tree?" he asked. "I haven't decided. Something with good root depth. Something that earns its place." He nodded slowly, the engineer assessing the specifications of a project. "We'll need to document the soil amendment process," he said. "For whoever comes after, they'll need to know the chemistry." "I know, I've been keeping notes." He looked at her. "Since when?" "Since the beginning," she shrugged. "Someone has to." The Voth patrol came again 4 nights later, and this time it was different. It was not the sweep, it was stationary, a sustained scan that lasted 11 minutes, focused on a point 50 meters from the dome's west wall. Kale and Sane watched it from inside, pressed against the inner surface, neither speaking. Kale counted her own heartbeats. She had a habit of counting things when she was afraid, a technique she had developed at 8 years old when the first ships broke atmosphere and her mother had held her and told her to count. Just count. Counting means you're still here. 11 minutes. Then the scan moved on. "They found something," Sane said. "The green light," Kale said. "I think it was bioluminescence from something in the soil, an organism that survived. They found an anomaly." "And scanned it." "And scanned it and found it insufficient for reclassification. If they thought it was significant, we'd know." She paused. "I think they're nearly done with this sector. The scan density is changing. They're doing confirmatory sweeps, not exploratory ones. They're cross-checking their data before they move on." He looked at her. "You've been watching their patterns." "Someone has too." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the amber sky deepened toward the particular dark of the planet's nights, which was not full dark. There was always the ambient glow of whatever the Voth ships were doing, the orange of processing, the occasional sweep of survey equipment, but was enough dark to rest in, enough dark to feel like the world was offering a temporary armistice. "My daughter," he said, "used to say that the most important skill in engineering was knowing when a system was telling you something you needed to hear." He paused. "I think this system is telling us something." "What is it telling us?" "That it's not done yet." He looked at Aldrich in the pond, moving in slow, confident circles, the transition now complete, the biology settled into its new arrangement. "That done isn't the same as finished." Kale felt something shift in her chest, that pressure change feeling again, and this time it did not resolve into waiting. It resolved into something clearer, not certainty. She was too careful for certainty, but direction. The specific sensation of having identified the next step and knowing that you were capable of taking it. She thought about her mother's kitchen, the steam and the noise and the warmth, the yellow walls. She thought about her grandmother, kneeling in the garden, explaining that the herb with the small purple flowers was for the nights your heart wouldn't slow. She thought about her daughter, the one she had not had yet, the one she was beginning to understand was possible. She thought about a tree. The weeks that followed were the busiest they had been since the first season, when the urgency of establishing the dome's basic systems had occupied every waking hour. The grow beds responded to the amended soil chemistry with a vigor that felt slightly personal, as if the plants had been waiting for this specific adjustment, the way you waited for a conversation to get to the real subject. Kale documented everything, the amendment ratios, the pH monitoring intervals, the progression of each species, the small failures and course corrections. She also began keeping a different kind of record, Not the technical log, which was meticulous and systematic. Something else, a document written in the plain, unhurried way of someone writing for an audience that did not yet exist. She wrote about the dome. She wrote about the pond and Aldrich and the sequential hermaphroditism and what it meant, in terms she tried to make clear and unmystified. She wrote about the soil chemistry and the grow-bed amendments. She wrote about the Voth patrol patterns and what they suggested about the extraction timeline. And she wrote about the green light. She wrote about it in the way you wrote about something you could not yet explain, but were not willing to dismiss, with the specific scientific patience of noting an observation and leaving the interpretation open, because the world had a long history of providing interpretations for things that initially appeared inexplicable, and the interpretations were usually more interesting than the inexplicability. Sane read what she wrote without commenting on most of it. He added technical annotations to the soil sections and the aquaponics sections, the additions legible as his, precise, spare, the grammar of a man who considered every word a small expenditure. Toward the end of her green light entry, in the margin, he had written, "I think I know what it is. I'll run the spectral analysis." He ran the spectral analysis. It was bioluminescent bacteria, not alien in origin, not externally introduced, resident in the native soil, a population that had survived the initial atmospheric changes in a dormant state, and had been triggered by the altered chemistry of the upper soil layers, the runoff from her early grow-bed experiments. Life that had been waiting in the ground, old life, patient life, coming up through the dead soil like a very slow question asking whether the conditions had finally changed. They had. Cale stood outside the dome for the first time in 6 months, the night Sane completed the analysis. They both did, standing in the amber dark with the recycled air masks over their faces, inefficient and slightly absurd. But out, beyond the wall, the sky above them vast and peculiar and present in the way that only open sky was present, with its particular quality of being larger than anything you could contain in your mind. The ground under their feet was the same ground it had always been. The sky was the same sky. But the bacteria in the soil was alive, and the dome behind them was alive, and the grow beds inside were alive, and Aldrich was alive, and Cale's body was doing the thing that it was doing, which was quietly and without permission engaging the same mechanism that a fish in a sealed pond had engaged when conditions shifted and survival required something new. Biology improvises. She looked at Sane. He was looking at the horizon, where the distant orange glow of a Voth processing installation marked the sky in a long, low band, beautiful in the way that things could be beautiful and catastrophic simultaneously, a skill the universe seemed to practice with particular confidence. "How long until they're done?" she asked. "A year," he said, "maybe 14 months." He paused. "The southern sector is ahead of schedule. So the atmospheric pressure will stabilize before we run out of food. If the grow beds hold and the pond continues." "They'll hold." She said it the way you said things when they needed to be true rather than confirmed. "I'll make them hold." He turned to look at her. In the amber light, with the mask covering the lower half of his face, she could only see his eyes, but his eyes had always been the most expressive part of him, the part that ran ahead of his economy with words and arrived at the destination before the words got there. "I know," he said. They stood for a while longer. The Voth glow pulsed on the horizon in its slow, indifferent rhythm, the planet being processed, the world they had known being converted into something the Voth needed and they did not. But the bacteria was alive in the ground. The dome was standing. The grow beds were growing. Somewhere 50 meters from the dome's west wall, the soil glowed its soft particular green in the dark, too small for the Voth surveys to classify, too alive to ignore. Cale thought about the tree she was going to plant, the one that earned its place, the one that would still be there when it was not them anymore. She had already decided what kind. An oak. They were slow and they were deep-rooted and they were obstinate in the specific way of things that had decided they were not finished yet. Her grandmother had had an oak in the back of the garden, old when she was young, still there, she refused to think had been there. She thought was there, still, patient in the deep soil, taller than the house, wider than a person's arms could reach. We'll plant it, she thought, for whoever comes after. For the ones who will need to know that something was here, that people were here, stubborn and ordinary and alive, eating their fish and naming their plants and keeping their notes and standing outside in amber dark to look at the sky. She reached across and took Sane's hand. It was a small gesture. He squeezed once in return, brief and certain. They went back inside. The dome sealed behind them with its usual sound, the particular compression hiss of the seals catching, the small adjustment of pressure that meant inside. Kale pulled off her mask and took a breath of the dome's recycled air, which smelled like wet clay and old metal, and the sourness of two people living in close quarters, which smelled like the specific accumulated ordinary smell of being alive. In the grow bed, the seedlings were growing. In the pond, Aldrich moved in slow circles. In the notebook on the workshop table, Kale's record continued its quiet accumulation of evidence that the world was not finished yet. The pH levels, the bacterial counts, the patrol intervals, the amendment ratios, the names. She sat down at the table and opened the notebook and picked up the pen. She turned to the last page she had written and then turned to the next blank page, and she thought for a moment about what to write, what the next true thing was. She wrote day 782. The bacteria in the south soil is active. The Voth are conducting confirmatory sweeps, see attached interval data. The grow beds are producing. Aldrich is healthy. We went outside tonight. She paused. Then she wrote, we are going to be here when they leave. We are going to plant a tree. She looked at what she had written for a long time. Then she turned the page. The new page was blank, the way new pages were, the way mornings were, the way the season would eventually be when the amber cleared and the sky showed its old color again. The specific blue that she carried in memory, the way you carried the names of people you loved, the way you carried all the small particular evidence of a world that had existed and would exist again. She began to draw. Not the technical schematics that filled the earlier pages of the notebook, the dome dimensions, the pond layout, the grow bed grid, something else. A map, rough and large, the kind made by someone who was not thinking about scale but about intention. The dome at the center, the west wall where the bacteria glowed, the south soil where she would plant the oak, once the atmosphere stabilized and the pressure normalized and the long, patient recovery of the surface began. The road that she imagined leading away from it, toward wherever the cities had been, toward the people who would eventually be there, because they would be there. She believed this with the specific stubbornness of someone who had watched biology improvise its way through a sealed pond, and understood that the universe had a strong prior commitment to the continuation of things. She drew the oak where it would go. She drew the road. She drew, at the edge of the paper, small and approximate, the kitchen window she remembered from childhood, the yellow walls visible through it, the steam. When Sane came in from the workshop, she turned the notebook so he could see. He looked at the map for a long time. She watched his face, the engineer's face reading the specifications of something, assessing feasibility, calculating the variables. Then he reached into the workshop supply box and pulled out a pen, and he sat down beside her, and without saying anything, he began to add to the map. He drew the water system first. Of course he did, the reclamation pipes, the distribution network, the wells they would dig once the soil pressure allowed. He drew the layout of a larger grow space, the orientation calculated to the sun angle for this latitude. He drew the measurement lines with their small notations, the particular precise scrawl of his annotations. He drew, at the north edge of the map, a small square with a window, his daughter's house. He did not label it, but Kale understood what it was. She reached across and added to it, a small rectangle beside it, a garden. They worked on the map until the dome's lights cycled toward their sleep phase. Neither of them said much. There was not much that needed to be said. The map was what needed to be said, the act of drawing it on the specific page of the specific notebook on the specific day when they had gone outside and come back in. When the lights finally dimmed, Sane folded the map carefully and placed it between two of the reference texts in the workshop, where the moisture wouldn't reach it. Kale sat for a moment longer in the low light. From the pond, the soft sound of water moving, Aldrich making his circles. From the grow bed, the smell of soil and growth, the particular living smell of things making themselves from available materials, improvising in the dark. From outside the dome, 50 meters to the west, invisible but present in the data and in the record, and in the body of knowledge they had built over 782 days of patient, stubborn, particular attention, the soft green light of life that had been waiting in the ground. It had not needed saving. It had needed time. She turned off the last light. The dome settled into its night sounds, the recycler, the water, the small adjustments of materials cooling at the edges, and Kale lay in her alcove and looked at the dark above her, which was not the dark of absence but the dark of everything that was there and simply waiting for the light to come back. She put her hand flat on the cool wall of the dome beside her. Outside, the soil hummed with its green and patient fire. She breathed. She counted. She was still here. Outside, the amber sky held no particular promise. It never had. But the dome did not require promises from the sky. The dome required attention and patience, and the specific human willingness to keep records even when the records felt like they were being written for no one. Kale kept records for everyone. She kept the name of every fish that had died in the pond, Sam first, then the others, one by one through the lean second year, and then the recovery beginning with Aldrich's transformation. She kept the name of every plant that had failed in the grow beds, the conditions noted, the hypothesis revised, the next attempt logged without shame. She kept Sane's daughter's name in the notebook, and her own mother's name, and her grandmother's name, and the name of the garden behind the house that she had told herself still existed, the oak above it still root deep in undestroyed soil. She kept her own name, written on the inside cover in ink that had faded to rust brown with time. Just the name, and beneath it the date she had arrived at the dome, and beneath that a single line that she had not planned to write and could not now explain, but had written anyway during the second month when the food was running low, and the recycler was struggling, and the Voth ships had moved into the adjacent sector, and the sky was the color of old wounds. This is not the end of it. She did not know, when she wrote it, whether it was a fact or a decision. She had come to understand that there was not always a meaningful difference. On the morning of day 803, Sane woke early and came to the grow beds where Kale was already working, already annotating the Third Amendment cycle, and he stood in the door of the grow area and said nothing for a moment and then said, "The southern sector is complete." Kale looked up. "They're moving on?" she asked. "The patrol intervals have shifted to withdrawal pattern, same as Sector 7 before it cleared." He leaned against the doorframe. He was 62 years old, and he had the particular quality of permanence that old engineers had, built from decades of solving problems that were real rather than imagined, the kind of person who had never taken up much space but was always precisely where he was needed. 6 to 8 months, I'd estimate. Then the atmospheric processing will slow, then it will stop, then recovery begins. Kale sat back on her heels. The grow bed in front of her smelled of healthy earth, actual healthy earth, not the inert mineral-laden substrate of the first years, but something alive and working, something that had been dead and was not dead anymore. She thought about the tree. "I want to start a seedling now," she said, "inside the dome, so it's ready to plant when the soil outside stabilizes. He was quiet for a moment. An oak takes 40 years to produce its first acorns, he said. I know. We will almost certainly not be alive to see it produce. I know. He looked at her for a long time with that engineer's gaze, the one that assessed without judgment and drew its own conclusions separately from what he would say. Then he said, I think I saw acorns in the seed archive. Third box, middle shelf. She stood up, soil on her knees, on her forearms, in the particular creases of her hands. She was 31 years old, lean as the last 2 years had made her, hair growing back unevenly. A woman who had learned soil chemistry from a reference text and aquaponics from a manual and the Voth patrol patterns from attention, and who had kept every name, and who had drawn a map by hand in a worn notebook that was now stored between the reference texts in the workshop, dry and preserved and waiting. She crossed the dome to the seed archive. She found the acorns, small and dense and brown, each one a compressed version of something that could be 100 years old and 30 meters tall and more permanent than almost anything else she could think of. She held one in her palm and stood with it for a while. The thing about an oak was that it was not dramatic. It did not solve a crisis. It did not fight back. It did not resist in any observable way. It put down roots in whatever ground it had, and it was quiet, and it was extremely long-lived, and eventually, after decades of being present without announcement, it was simply there, irreplaceable, load-bearing in ways that were difficult to articulate, a fact the landscape had organized itself around. It required nothing more than time and the willingness of someone to plant it. She curled her fingers around the acorn. From the pond, the sound of Aldrich's water. From the grow bed, the smell of living soil. From outside, 50 meters west, invisible and perfectly real, the green glow of bacteria that had waded through everything and had not been extinguished. She had never been dramatic about any of it. She had just been there, keeping the records, making the amendments, adjusting the ratios, naming the things. Staying. That was the whole of it. The entire human answer to everything the universe had tried. Not genius, not technology, not the dramatic reversal, the last-second triumph, the revelation that changed everything. Just staying. Staying until the conditions changed. Staying until biology improvised. Staying until the oak was in the ground and the map was in the notebook, and the notebook was in the hands of whoever came next. Whoever arrived at this specific latitude and found the soil amended and the dome standing and the record waiting for them, page after page of what it cost and how it was done, and on the inside cover, the name of the person who had decided in the second month when everything looked like an ending, that this was not the end of it. She carried the acorn to the grow bed. She made a small hollow in the soil with her thumb. She placed the acorn inside. She covered it. She looked at it for a moment, covered and invisible, a small brown object that gave nothing away, that contained within its unremarkable density the entire blueprint for a thing that would outlive her insane, and the Voth extraction cycle, and the amber sky, and possibly, if she planted it well, the memory of what this period had cost. She had a particular feeling about that. She wanted the tree to be a record too. Not labeled, not carved with dates and names, just a tree, doing what trees did, being large and old and deeply rooted in soil that had been amended by specific hands and the specific knowledge of a woman who had kept the notes. People who came after would not necessarily know what the soil contained or why it was healthy when the soil around it was not. They would just find good earth. They would plant in it. Things would grow. They would think it was luck, or they would think it was nature, and they would not be entirely wrong about that. It was nature, biology improvising the same way it always had, using the mechanisms available, and the mechanism available here had been a half-orc woman with cracked knuckles and a notebook, and the refusal to accept that conditions were permanent. She went to the notebook and wrote, Day 803. The Voth are withdrawing from the southern sector, Estimated atmospheric stabilization 6 to 8 months. Oak seedling initiated, grow bed 6, northeast corner. Expected transplant date, spring of recovery year 1. She turned the page. She picked up the pen. She wrote, "This is not the end of it." She looked at the words. The same words she had written in month 2 when they had been uncertain. They were not uncertain now. They were just true, the kind of true that got truer the longer you looked at it. The kind that had always been true and was finally, slowly, in the quiet medium of a worn notebook on a shelf in a leaning oval dome on the surface of a recovering world, getting around to being known. Sane appeared at the workshop door. He was carrying 2 cups of the thin vegetable broth they had been making since the grow bed started producing, which tasted mostly of hot water and determination, and, increasingly, of actual vegetables. He had never stopped making 2 cups. In the worst periods, when there had barely been enough for one, he had still made 2, one slightly larger than the other, a small stubborn insistence on the continuation of the ritual. She took the cup. They stood in the workshop in the dim glow of the dome's night cycle and drank without talking, and she thought about the map, which was in the reference texts, and the acorn which was in the soil, and the bacteria which was outside in the ground, and Aldrich who was in the pond, and the name on the inside cover of the notebook, and the line beneath it. She thought about her daughter, whose existence was still theoretical, and whose name she had not decided on yet, but who she was beginning to think about in specific terms. What kind of person she might be, what she would need to know, what the world would look like by the time she was old enough to read a notebook written by a woman in a dome during the bad years. She thought about the oak, the slow growth of it, the roots going down through the amended soil, finding the moisture, finding the chemistry, finding whatever was there to be found, the decades of quiet before the first acorns, the generations that would come and go before the tree was old. She thought about her grandmother kneeling in the garden by the wall, the afternoon light on the old brick, the smell of the herbs, the patient explanation of which one was for headaches, and which one was for the nights your heart would not slow. The specific texture of accumulated knowledge passed from hands to hands, not through any formal mechanism, just through the ordinary proximity of people who cared about each other and cared about what grew. That was what the notebook was. Not a scientific record, not only, a proximity. A way of being next to whoever came after, close enough that they could hear the tone of it, the specific human sound of someone paying attention in difficult conditions and finding it was still worth paying attention, that the world still had things worth noting down. She set her cup on the table. She went back to the grow bed. She sat cross-legged in front of the northeast corner where the acorn was buried, and she put her hand flat on the soil, the way she had put her hand flat on the dome wall outside, listening. The soil was cool and slightly damp from the morning watering, the texture exactly what she had spent 2 years working toward, the particular granular life of earth that had been given back what it needed. Under her hand, in the dark of the soil, the acorn was beginning its first almost imperceptible shift. Not growth yet, not the splitting of the casing or the reaching of the first root, just the cellular response to moisture, the very beginning of the very beginning, too small to measure, completely real. She left her hand there for a while. Then she went back to the workshop and sat with Sane in the dim light, and they talked about nothing in particular. The Voth's withdrawal pattern, the optimal transplant window for the oak, the fish in the pond, whether the third grow bed would be ready for a second planting cycle before the season turned. The small, precise talk of people managing the material facts of their world, familiar and unglamorous, and the truest form of hope she knew. Outside, the amber sky was lightening toward the dome's morning cycle. Somewhere below the west wall, the bioluminescent bacteria continued its quiet, sourceless glow, doing what it had always done, patient and unimpressed by the scale of what had tried to end it. In the pond, Aldrich moved in circles, as she always did now. In the grow beds, things grew. Kale picked up the notebook one more time before the morning lights cycled fully up. She turned to the inside cover. Her name faded to rust brown, the date of arrival, the line beneath. She added one more line below the first in the pen she had been using since page 1. Day 803. The oak is in the ground. She closed the notebook. She set it carefully back on the shelf between the reference texts. She looked at the dome around her, the imperfect walls, the repaired seams, the lean to the left side, the particular achieved quality of a structure that had no right to still be standing and was standing anyway, because someone had built it with their hands out of available materials and sealant tape, and a refusal to accept that available materials were not enough. The recycler cycled. The lights came up. She went to begin the morning measurements. The world was not finished yet. Neither was she.